Alright, what's up everybody? This is Mr. Deal and welcome to Unit 2. Congratulations on making it through Unit 1. So for Unit 2 we start off talking about types and purposes of government. And the reason we do this is because as we went through citizenship, we talk mostly about how we were citizens of the United States. But the thing is the world is much bigger than the United States. So in this unit we're going to talk about other countries, the types of governments they have, potential reasons why they have those governments, what type of stuff works for them, and what we have here in the United States. So the big question we got to ask ourselves is, why do we actually need government? What purpose does government even exist for? And it boils down to four main reasons. The first of which is simply to keep order. Now, you and I as ordinary citizens, we don't go out policing the cities. We don't go out policing the streets. We go about our lives, and we kind of need to go about our lives. We need someone who is willing to choose to use their life in order to protect ours and to keep ours safe. And so government kind of fills in that purpose. We pay taxes to the government. The government in return hires people to do that sort of job of keeping order, making sure things are peaceful at home. And right now, probably a lot of you have seen on the news of protests and some rioting, and you'll see the police a lot of times are showing up in riot gear. They've got shields, they've got tear gas, they've got rubber bullets, and that's generally a very rare thing. Most interactions with the government of trying to keep order are very, very civil. They're very day-to-day sort of things. Maybe it's a traffic stop for someone speeding or going through a stop sign, or maybe it's, having lines on the road so that cars aren't weaving in all over the place. It's speed limits. It's little things that we live with so much we don't truly appreciate them until they're gone. So the second thing that the government does is it protects the country. And by that one's usually pretty easy, because pretty much anything involving protecting the country has to deal with the military. So as we've mentioned in the citizenship unit, gentlemen at the age of 18, you'll end up being required to register for the Selective Services, which is also known as the U.S. Draft. In the very rare case rare chance that the government would actually do that, you would be required to go serve in the military to protect the country. And that one's pretty self-explanatory. It's usually just protecting from outside threats. The difference between keeping order and protecting the country: keeping order is generally from inside threats, so from citizens acting in a harmful way towards one another, and protecting the country is more about keeping citizens safe from other countries. Third thing they do is provide service, and service is really things that your grandparents might have Social Security checks coming in the mail. Social Security is something that adults pay into while they're working, and at the end, when they retire, when they hit 65 or in some cases 62, they'll start to collect a little bit of money so they don't have to work, so they've got enough to pay their bills month to month. That's a type of government service. So we're giving the government something, and it's giving us something in return so that we don't have to do it for ourselves down the road. These things are also like the trash collection. If we didn't have trash collection, the roads would be very stinky. We used to not have trash collections well over 100 years ago, and disease was a big problem because of that. So the government stepped in and said, hey, a little bit of tax money, we'll hire people to help clean up the streets. And that's what it does. So pretty much anything the government does for us so that we don't have to do for ourselves, things like the mail, things like the trash, things like Social Security, things like food stamps or assistive housing. These type of things are all examples of us giving the government a little bit of money, or in some cases a little bit more money, and them giving us something in return. Finally, the last thing is guidance. And this one is generally a little more difficult to understand because it has to do mostly with money. And the government does make a lot of decisions involving money, some of which most of which involve taxes, but the government also spends a lot of money in that it buys things from businesses. It invests in projects. So several years ago, like clean energy was a big one that the government was investing in and helping to subsidize, which means the government was actually giving businesses money to try and do things like with solar energy or with wind turbines. The government right now is helping to fund research to find a cure for the coronavirus. It's doing that through several research labs. And those are kind of the extreme cases, but the day-to-day is just how is the government going to spend tax money, and what is it going to do with the money that we give it. So next up, we got different types of government. And to start us off, we go with no government, which technically might not be a type of government because there is no government, but it is. So we call this thing anarchy. And the word anarchy breaks down into two things. An just meaning none or a lack of, and archy meaning government. So the word literally just means no government. It's basically a society that has no laws. There's no one keeping order. Pretty much it's a free-for-all, which, maybe to a teenager sounds amazing. But as people soon realize that it's a very dangerous place to live in, and there are no guarantees that anything you have today will be there tomorrow. And that includes people's lives. And that's why anarchies are not a common thing. In fact, generally you only find them in maybe small pockets, so like maybe a village or something, just somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. Somalia is kind of an example of one because it doesn't really have a functioning government. It's got one, but the government doesn't really do anything. And Somalia is just that country on the Horn of Africa that we've got highlighted and boxed in the picture. So next up we have autocracy, and autocracy is really about rule by a strong person, or at least that's how it started off with. So back in the times when we all lived in a little village, the autocrat was the leader who was generally the strongest warrior, or who was just the richest person. Maybe he had the most land, and people looked up to that person for guidance, for protection. And it kind of evolved into kings and queens, and later on dictators, which really gives us our two types of autocrats. So auto just means singular, and cracy again means rule. So the first off, we have monarchy, and a monarch is, it's the queen, it's the king. It's something that you come into power by being born into the family. And I think the most obvious example is Queen Elizabeth II of England, who is probably the oldest living woman on earth and will most likely never die. But there are quite a number of kings and queens in various African countries. There's a few in Southeast Asia. It's not so much a common type of government anymore. A lot of places have switched to some form of democracy, which we'll get into later on. The second type of autocracy is a dictatorship, and originally a dictator was someone in Roman times that was chosen by the senators, who were the group of people that made the laws in Rome. They were, in times of war, they would choose one person to lead the government, basically just to make decisions so they could make them quick, and that the senators wouldn't spend so much time talking back and forth that they would lose the war. And this was a very effective sort of government because the dictatorship did not last long. Usually it was only a few months or until the end of the war. But as time goes on, people get a taste for power, and eventually they take it. And so usually a dictator comes to power nowadays by just taking it. They usually have the backing of a military, or they do something a little shady. And we can think of dictators as like Kim Jong-un, or you guys learned last year in history, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin. These guys were dictators in that they ruled by power, and their rule was absolute. So they were pretty much the only person in charge. All right, we get into democracy. Now, democracy is the one you guys are probably most familiar with because you live it. And democracy just means rule by the people. Demo meaning people, and cracy meaning power. So it literally just means people power. Now, democracy breaks down into two separate components. One is a direct democracy. And direct means you're doing it yourself, and that's literally just people voting on it. So if you guys were in class and I said, hey, we're going to have a pizza party later on, raise your hand if you want pepperoni. And, 7 people raise their hand for pepperoni, and I said, okay, raise your hand if you want supreme. And 4 people raise their hand for supreme. Well, in a direct democracy, the 7 that voted for pepperoni have a bigger say than the 4 that voted for supreme, and that's direct democracy. So we'd end up with pepperoni pizza. Now, imagine this. It works in a class, but imagine getting 330 million Americans to all gather in one place, and we ask them the same questions, and they all raise their hand, and we have to count all 330 million Americans. Is that going to work? If you're thinking yes, think again. The answer is no. That would take forever. So we don't have direct democracy. Very few governments have a direct democracy. You'll usually only find them in very small places. Switzerland, some towns in Switzerland have that, where, as you see in the picture, they'll gather in the town square. Someone will say, hey, I would like to vote on this, and they'll talk about it, and the people will raise their hand, they'll do the count. But usually if you get more than 100 or a low number in the thousands, it gets a little bit more complicated just because of trying to count everybody. So, as they're saying, most countries are a lot bigger than that, and we have something called a representative democracy, which is what we have here in the U.S. And when you represent something, that means you stand for something other than yourself. And that's exactly what happens here in the U.S. So we, the people, choose someone to represent us, to say, hey, look, I got a bunch of people back home, and this is what they care about, and I'm fighting for them.
Mr. Asbell, please come to the attendance window. Mr. Asbell, please come to the
They're making an announcement over the school system. All right, so representative democracy is where the people, so you and I, when you become a voting age, elect someone to make decisions for you simply because you've got a life to live. You don't have time to go up to Washington, D.C., or go to the Vinton Town Council, or go to Richmond, Virginia, and argue with a bunch of people about, where the traffic signs should be, how much tax money should be taken out of your paycheck. You don't have time for that. You got a life to live. So we elect someone to make those decisions for us, and they're supposed to represent our needs to the rest of the people. It's America. Most countries have some sort of representative democracy because it's effective and it works. You'll find places around the world that sometimes have a mixture of different types of governments. England, for example, still has a monarch, still has the queen. She doesn't actually make the rules. They have a what's called a constitutional monarchy, and that just means they have a government that is set up by their members in Parliament, which, if you remember back to 6th grade, Parliament was the group of people that make laws for England, and they would often have to get the King's stamp of approval. Well, now they don't have to get the King involved, or the Queen, in this case, involved. She doesn't really make any decisions. It's just Parliament now. So next type of government is oligarchy, and I like to talk about oligarchies because they're just an interesting group. Generally, it just means that a few people at the very top, they're either really well connected to the military and they've got the backing of the nation's military, or they're just insanely rich and they can buy people off. Usually it's a small group of people, and they're the ones making the decisions. And this picture that's showing up, it's kind of a joke because in the last few elections, a lot of the people running have been related to one another. So George Bush, who was president, his son, George Bush Jr., later became president. Hillary Clinton, who was Bill Clinton's wife when Bill Clinton was in office in 92 to 2000. She later ran for president back in 2016, and as you know, she did not win. But a lot of people in government kind of keep it in the family. And so there's a joke that the United States is an oligarchy. It is not. It is a representative democracy, because you and I have the chance and we have the power to get into the government. But places that is an actual oligarchy is someplace like China, which China is run by the Communist Party, and the Communist Party is a very select group of people, and you have to be in the know with the party to make the decisions. Russia is kind of an example, because after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was a few people who were very well connected that kind of took the power, and they still make a lot of decisions today. So the next up, and our last form of government, is a theocracy. And the word theo means religion. So cracy means power, theo means religion. That means the religious body is in power. So this just means if you're a place like Vatican City, which is what you see now. Vatican City is the headquarters and capital of the Catholic-run nation. It's very small. It's actually in the middle of Rome, which is in Italy, and Vatican City is entirely based off the teachings of the Catholic faith through the Bible, and the Pope, which you've probably heard of before, is the head of the church and of Vatican City. There are other places around the world, like Iran, that are run by their views are based on the teachings of Allah and the Quran. You'll find a lot of this type of rule in the Middle East and in parts of Africa, where religion takes a very strong view and of how the government is run. And you'll find it a little bit in South America as well.